don't know this about me, but I have a fear of elevators. But don't worry, I'm taking steps to overcome it. This morning we're going to talk some about fear and anxiety and worry. As we continue our study through the Gospel of Luke, chapter 12 has a lot to say about anxiety and worry. Jesus tells us not to do that. Don't be anxious. And over the past week, I haven't been here in town. I was at a small town pastors conference in Morton, Illinois. So I did most of my preparation for this Sunday the week before that, leading up to when Owen gave the message. And Owen, you did a great job. Thank you. But as I was gone for the week, I decided that I needed to change the message that I had prepared. First of all, I decided that I needed to break the one message I'd prepared into multiple messages, partly because there was a lot of material to cover, but also because anxiety is kind of a growing problem in our culture. And I think it would be good to address it further. Now, it's not something that I particularly have a lot of struggles with. So for me, I was ready to just charge right on through. But I understand that not everyone has the disposition that I have. Some people are more prone to fear and worry, to anxiety. And so I thought I would slow down. And when I decided to slow down and take multiple weeks for this, I also decided it would be helpful if we set it up with a look at something a little bit different. And so what we're actually going to cover this morning is the story of Joseph out of the book of Genesis. Now, we've also been doing a series in Genesis that we've been in and out of for the last couple of years, and we'll get back to that at some point, and at some point in that study we'll come to Joseph. And we'll study it much more closely then, because Joseph's story takes up 13 chapters in the book of Genesis, and that will probably take us some 13 weeks to study. Today we're going to do it in one. So, I wanted to cover his story, though, because it sets up one particular point. But as we come to the story of Joseph this morning, there are some things that are important to know about Joseph that we would come to in Genesis when we get there, but we'll have to set up for you now. Joseph was the 11th of 12 sons born to his father, Israel. His father's name was Jacob when he was born, but God changed his name to Israel. That's where we get the name for the people of Israel, the nation of Israel today. And the 12 tribes of Israel are Israel's 12 sons. We could go on a lot of bunny trails there, but we won't. But Joseph was his father's favorite son. Now, I can tell you that I have a favorite son. His name is Caleb, and I can say that very confidently because I only have one. But when you have 12 sons and you pick out a favorite, it sets up an opportunity for great tension in your family. And that's definitely something that comes into play here. But Israel didn't just pick a favorite. He let everyone know that he had a favorite. He gave Joseph what you may have heard referred to as a Technicolor dream coat. My stroller is blowing away in the wind out there. I think it's going to be okay, but I just saw something moving. So he gave him a special coat full of color. It set him apart in the family. And that wasn't necessarily great for Joseph. It was nice to receive the coat, but to receive the ire of his brothers was not so good. But Joseph didn't do a lot to help himself. He also had some dreams that if I were him, I would have kept to myself. But he had two dreams in particular that he shared with his family, and they heard these things, and they didn't really help his case. In one dream, he and his brothers were harvesting grain, and they were setting them up in sheaves, and the 11 sheaves of his brothers all bowed down to his grain. And then another dream, the sun, the moon, and 11 stars bowed down to Joseph. These are dreams in which his family is all bowing down to him. People don't really like it when their brothers are telling them, you're all going to bow to me someday. So that sets up kind of the dynamics in this family that are important. Now, Joseph's family, they were largely shepherds, and so at one point, Joseph and probably his younger brother Benjamin were at home with their father, while the 10 older brothers were off grazing the sheep. And they would go from place to place. They would travel sometimes great distances to care for their sheep. And so Joseph was tasked with going out to check on his brothers and the sheep and figure out how things were going. And I imagine as he's going to find his brothers, he's thinking to himself, yeah, they don't like me very much and they might pick on me, but what's the worst that could happen, right? It's not like they're going to throw me in a pit and sell me to slave traders and I'm going to end up in Egypt. And so he keeps going and he shows up and he greets his brothers, finds out what's going on, and the brothers are not happy to see him. And they grab him and they throw him in a pit into the bottom of a dry well. And the brothers are discussing among themselves what they should do with this dreamer. Some of them think they should just kill him right there. Have it all over with. But cooler heads prevailed, and they thought if we just kill him, we don't get much out of that. But if we sell him, we can get something, and he's gone. And so that's what they decide to do. They take the technicolored dream coat, they tear it up as if it was torn by wild animals. They put blood on it so that they can show it to their father and make up a story about him being killed. But instead of killing him, they sell him to Ishmaelite slave traders on their way to Egypt. Now, I imagine that as Joseph is on his way to Egypt, he might think, well, this isn't going very well. But even now, what's the worst that could happen, right? It's not like I'm going to be bought by someone whose wife is going to fall in love with me and she's going to accuse me of something, I'm going to end up in prison, right? That's never going to happen. So he gets to Egypt, and he's purchased by Potiphar, who is an official in Pharaoh's household. And what we read there is that God was with Joseph in Potiphar's house. And his character, his ability, and God being with him allowed him to kind of raise up in power. Even as a slave within Potiphar's household, he became basically second in charge in the whole household. The only person with more authority in that house was Potiphar himself. Everyone else answered to him. But sure enough, Potiphar's wife kind of had a liking for Joseph. She would make advances and he would turn her down until one day, when he was doing his work in the house and there were no other people around except for Potiphar's wife, she made another advance. She grabbed him by the coat and he said no. And he left the coat with her to run away. And she took that as an opportunity to say, if he's not going to give in, then we need to get rid of him. And she called for the other servants and slaves and said that this Hebrew who was brought into this house tried to rape me, and see, I have his coat here with me. And so he was thrown into prison. And yet, even in prison, we read that God was with Joseph. Now, in prison, it's a little different than prisons are today. He was able to kind of rise up even within the prison, to the point that all of the other prisoners answered to Joseph. He's getting all of this experience leading in different ways because God is with him. But at one point, while he's in prison, two other servants of Pharaoh were thrown into prison as well. One was a cupbearer and one was a baker. And so they were getting to know Joseph there in prison when one night they each had dreams that troubled them greatly. Well, Joseph, having had dreams of his own, had some familiarity, and God allowed him to understand and interpret these dreams. And so, from the dream of the cupbearer, Joseph told him that in 3 days, you will be restored to your position in Pharaoh's household. But from the dream of the baker, he told him that in 3 days he would be killed. And sure enough, in 3 days, these things happened to each of them. And the cupbearer promised Joseph he would remember him when he was restored, but the cupbearer went off and he was much too busy being freed from prison to remember Joseph. And so Joseph remained there in prison. Until one day, when Pharaoh himself had dreams, and none of Pharaoh's wise men or advisors or anyone could interpret these dreams to him. And then the cupbearer heard about it, and he remembered, oh, I was supposed to remember that guy in prison, and I never did, but now I do, so I'll tell Pharaoh. Pharaoh, I know a guy who happens to be pretty good at dreams. You should call him out of the prison, and maybe he can help you. And so Joseph was called out of the prison into Pharaoh's court. He was cleaned up and given the opportunity to interpret these dreams. And so that's exactly what he did. God allowed him to understand these dreams. The first of Pharaoh's dreams was a dream in which there were 7 healthy, fat cows grazing along the banks of the Nile River, when suddenly out of the river came up 7 ugly, lean cows who ate and devoured the healthy, fat cows. And yet after their devouring, they looked just as ugly and lean as they had before. The second dream was on a stalk of grain. At first, there were 7 healthy ears of grain on that stalk, but then came up out of the stalk 7 blighted ears who were dried up and beaten by the east wind. And those blighted ears ate the 7 healthy ears of grain on that stalk, and yet they looked just as blighted as they had before. And Joseph interpreted this dream, and he said that Pharaoh, this dream indicates what is going to happen in Egypt. In the next 7 years, there will be plenty. There will be great harvests. There will be fat cattle and healthy ears of grain. But after that will come a time of famine, 7 years of famine. And so Joseph went on to explain what he thought would be a good approach to this coming time. He suggested that during these 7 years of plenty, that the Pharaoh should take a 20% tax on all of the harvests in order to make stockpiles and survive during the time of famine that was to come. Well, Pharaoh not only appreciated the interpretation to his dreams, but he saw wisdom in this plan, and so he elevated Joseph to be the administrator of this plan and raised him, in fact, to being second in command in all of Egypt. Only Pharaoh himself reigned higher than Joseph. Now, everything happened just the way that Joseph said it would as he interpreted these dreams. There was a time of great abundance in Egypt, but then came a time of famine. And the famine extended beyond just Egypt. It extended all the way to Canaan, where Joseph's family was. And when they began to run out of food, they heard that there was, in fact, grain in Egypt. And so Israel sent his 10 oldest sons, keeping behind his youngest son Benjamin. He sent those 10 down to Egypt to get grain. Now, as it turned out, when they came to Egypt, they needed to meet with the person who was administering this whole project of storing grain. They had to come before Joseph. Now, in the time that Joseph had been away, he changed. He didn't look the same as they would have been used to. He would have had the appearance of an Egyptian at this point in his style and clothing and dress and in his speech and language. And so when they came before Joseph, they did not recognize him, but he recognized them right away. And he decided that he would test them to see if they would still do the kinds of things that they had done to him. And so he sold them grain, but he also accused them of being spies. And in order to prove that they weren't spies, he kept Simeon with him, one of his brothers, put him in jail, and said, if you are to come back and get more grain, if you are not spies, what you will do is you will bring your youngest brother back here with, because they had shared their story and what they were all about to try to prove they weren't spies. And so they told him about their father and about Benjamin, their youngest brother. And so they went home with the grain that they had received. And they told their father, and their father said, "You're not taking Benjamin down there. I've already lost Joseph, and now Simeon is gone. I'm not losing Benjamin as well." You see, if Joseph was his favorite son, Benjamin was his second favorite son. They were both born to him from his favorite wife, because he had 12 kids by 4 different wives. That's a whole story that we won't get into. But that's why he loved Benjamin so much, why he loved Joseph before him, and he was not willing that Benjamin should go. But when they began to run out of food again, the brothers came to their father and said, "We have to go back to Egypt, but we cannot go. We will not go if we don't go with Benjamin." And eventually it was Judah, another of the brothers, who said, "If anything happens to him, the blame will be on me." He was willing to accept that responsibility, and so Israel sent his sons back to Egypt. When they arrived, they were welcomed. There was a feast that was prepared for them. Simeon was released when it was clear, they brought back Benjamin, they're not spies. Joseph still knew everything that was going on, but his test was not yet over. They had their feast. They loaded up their grain. But Joseph told his servants who were loading the grain for his brothers to take his silver cup and to put it into the grain bag that Benjamin would have. And so everything is loaded. The brothers begin their journey back home with Simeon back with them. This seems to them to have gone perfectly. And yet, they get on the road a little bit, and all of a sudden guards come chasing after them. They bring them all together. They search their sacks, and there in Benjamin's sack is the silver cup belonging to Joseph. And they are all accused of being thieves. And they say that they'll take Benjamin back, but the rest of them can go, setting up the exact same scenario that this family faced with Joseph at the bottom of that pit. Would they give up their brother to make their lives easier? Well, they did not. They refused to give up Benjamin. And when they came back, refusing to let one stay behind, Joseph broke down in tears. And he revealed to his brothers that it was in fact him. That their brother that they had sold had been taken by God ahead of them in order that many lives would be saved. And so they're all welcomed there into Egypt. They don't have to take the grain back. They can bring all of their families down there to Egypt. They can live in the peace and prosperity that Joseph has been able to enjoy. So they all move down there. They get their own land. They have food again. Things are going well. And eventually, their father, Israel, dies. And when that happens, the brothers all get worried. They think to themselves, he's been nice to us because he loves his father. But now that his father is gone, he's going to get his revenge. And so they come and they plead with him. And this is the big point that I want to make out of the life of Joseph. In his response, at the end of the book of Genesis, chapter 50, verse 20, he says, "As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today." You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. I wanted to tell you that whole story about Joseph. 13 chapters of the book of Genesis, all because I wanted to emphasize that one verse from the very end. You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. It's a verse that shows great faith in the sovereignty of God. It shows that Joseph believed that God was in control of everything that happened, even using things that seemed like the worst possible scenario in order to bring about a good plan that God had. It reminds me a little bit of Romans 8:28 in the New Testament, which says, "And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose." Verses like these, and there are others as well, they encourage us to trust God even when things don't look good. Even when our worst case scenario is playing out, we can trust that God has a good plan that he is working on. These are hard things to accept, especially when you're going through that worst case scenario. It's hard to believe that God has a good plan. But if we learn to trust God in this way, it can help us to let go of a lot of our worries and anxieties and concerns. I recently heard a pastor say that it takes a lot of pride to worry. I don't think I'd ever thought of it that way before. But what he was saying was that our worries generally come from a concern that things are not going to turn out the way that we think is best. We worry that our kids won't get good grades. We worry that our peers or our friends won't like us. We worry that our crops will fail, that our parents or grandparents will get sick and die, that our spouse will cheat on us, that our government will ban the Bible, that the economy will fall into a recession, that the major world powers will start World War III. We worry that we'll be thrown into a pit and sold to Ishmaelite slave traders. There are endless things that we worry about when we think that we know what would be best. And we worry that what would be best won't happen. But when we learn to trust that God knows what's best and we don't, then it becomes much easier to trust. When we remember that Isaiah 55, verses 8 and 9 say that my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. You see, it takes great pride to think that our ideal outcomes are better than God's ideal outcomes. It's that pride that makes us worry that our ideal outcomes won't happen, rather than trusting that God's ideal outcomes will happen even when they look bad to us. Now, none of this means that bad things will never happen. People will still do things that are intended for evil, and they will hurt. Loved ones will still betray us, or they will get sick and die. Crops will still fail. Wars will still happen. And those things will still be bad. They will be evil. God will allow some evil in this world until he returns to judge the living and the dead. But that doesn't mean that he doesn't have a plan to bring good out of that evil. God is sovereign. He is in control. He was with Joseph in the pit. He was with Joseph in Potiphar's house. He was with Joseph in prison. And he was with Joseph as he ruled over Egypt as the second in command. And through it all, God brought about the salvation of many people, including his chosen people, the children of Israel. Perhaps the best example of all is the death and resurrection of Jesus. It didn't seem good to any of Jesus' followers that he died. They couldn't have ever imagined calling that Friday good like we call it today. They thought that evil had won. They thought that they had been deceived about the coming kingdom of God. They were ready to give it all up and go back to their former lives. But through the greatest evil in the history of this world, through the crucifixion of the Son of God, through the death of Jesus, God brought about the salvation of his chosen people. And in the resurrection, he proved definitively that what the world means for evil, God can use for good. And so I want to encourage you this morning to give up your pride and learn to trust that God's ways are better and higher than our ways. And start to expect that even in the face of great evil, even when the worst case scenario that we can imagine happens, that God has a good plan that he will bring about. Let's pray. God, these are hard things to accept and believe. They're especially hard when we are dealing with the things that we don't want to see happen. But God, I pray that you would work in our hearts today to allow us to change our thinking and to develop patterns and habits of thought that would trust in you and your ways, to recognize that we don't know everything that's going on and that you have plans, that you are able to bring about good from evil, and that you have demonstrated that most of all in the greatest way, when you brought about the greatest good from the greatest evil. That Jesus died at the hands of sinners, that he would save sinners like you, like me and us. God, we thank you for your plans and just ask that your Holy Spirit would help us to trust.